I've been trying to figure out how best to talk about the things that I do. It is reasonable, if we take cues from the last speaker, that I could talk about my artistic and entrepreneurial endeavors as a practice. So I'm going to try on yoga for a moment and try to imagine the thing that I do as a kind of practice. Artistic practice, yes, but maybe also from this image, a practice of looking at buildings that have been underused and undervalued for a long time, spaces that for a very long time have been told good things don't happen there and you shouldn't go there, environments that have seen systematic failure politically and otherwise, and the disinvestment has created emotional and spiritual disinvestment so that the people who are there are very excited to leave. My practice is rooted in black spaces that people are always trying to get away from. If I were to go on, I would say that maybe part of the practice, artistic and otherwise, has to do with my desire to imagine that those places that have been disregarded, emotionally disinvested in, that they have remnants of something great. Historical remnant, people remnants, object remnants, and that if I were to spend more and more time excavating through these seemingly devastated places, I would actually find a place that's great. And if I would spend time dusting off and cleaning the thing that people have said had no value, that I might find value exactly there. So we're looking at a church, St. Lawrence, that had these beautiful terracotta mosaics all over the floor, and I'm just starting to kind of dust them off and see what we have. But if we were to also look at moments, great moments in history, like when W.E.B. Du Bois was doing his study of the progress of black people in Georgia, that he could present at a conference in Paris, the Paris Exposition of Sociology, that even then, at the turn of the century, Du Bois was trying to say, in the last 50 years, from slavery till this date, 48 years later, black people have made considerable progress and have moved from rural places to urban places. They've developed farm implements. They have a number of patents. They are part of social clubs. They've created their own churches and sororities and fraternities. Black people are doing it. Du Bois, with a team of researchers in Atlanta, decided to make these kind of unexpectedly modernistic visual studies of it. But it's just language that people have forgotten about. And I decided that I would take that language and kind of turn that already sexy visual information into something that people could more readily understand and receive and be like, wow, that's a hot neon. And that hot neon would refer them back to information way. That in that way, I'm taking known history that's forgotten and trying to make something sexy happen as a result. I don't know how many of the people here know Ebony magazine, if you heard of Ebony, right? So about 4 blocks away, the former Johnson Publishing Company lived. And recently they announced that Johnson Publishing had been sold. The company had been disbanded. And in fact, the Getty Institute and the African American Museum in DC had received this windfall of amazing information. But this guy, John Johnson, this entrepreneur, and his wife, they were able to do something that hadn't been done ever in the United States, which was maybe partly what Du Bois was trying to do. They were trying to demonstrate that there was power in unexpected places in this country, and that if we would highlight these stories, amplify them, put them on the front of a magazine cover, show what was happening with black folk around the world, that other black people would be interested, and also America was curious about what was happening in the hood. Since America's curious, thought I'd share a little bit about what's happening in my hood. I started collecting things. Really, it didn't matter what the thing was. What mattered was that the thing was no longer interesting to others. I like the stuff that nobody wants. And it became this kind of practice of demonstrating that anything could have power and value if somebody would simply believe in it. University of Chicago gave me these slides. The slides are super beautiful. I started rummaging through the slides and found that not only was I interested in the stuff inside, the stuff was teaching me things that I was super interested in knowing, like a history of myself, my African self, my Germanic self, my Indo-Asian self, all of the selves that were inside me, that this slide collection was showing me, at least in visual imagery, that I mattered, that I show up all over the world. It was teaching me about architecture and design, about the spatial plans of sacred spaces. These 60,000 images turned me right on, in fact. And I decided that I would share those images with the world alongside the images from Johnson Publishing, that I would take these discarded notions, these things that people had just forgotten about, and would try to find ways through my artistic practice to make them relevant. About 2.5 years ago, I heard about a printing press, a Republican printing press in Boswell, Indiana, pronounced Basel. Because the place was pronounced Basel, and I'm an art geek, I thought, well, if there's a printing press in Basel, I should go and get it. From that printing press, I decided to start making these posters that could imagine a kind of speculative future for urban spaces. So I would create slogans like, "Please come home," from the Black Neighborhood Association Chicago chapter. There is no Black Neighborhood Association that I know of, but if you guys want to join, we could start one. Or, like the Citizens for the creation of equity among black renters. Like, what are the kinds of speculative corporations that we need in order to create the equity that we want to see? And so through these posters, things started out somewhat poetic, and then the poetic would transfer into something that felt like a kind of spatial intervention. I found out about this place called Malaga. It's a small island in Maine. Malaga was a place where people of varying races would end up, and it was a small fishing island. Over time, people of mixed race were born, and there were miscegenation laws in the late 1800s that kept black people and white people from mixing. They just thought, this is just not going to be good. And so all of the people of Malaga were kicked off the island, and I wanted to try to pay homage to the fact that for a long time, people have been trying to create alliances, or nature has been trying to do its thing, and humans, of course, are always getting in the way, trying to keep the brothers and the sisters from hooking up with each other. But I found myself really excited about this notion of a kind of a New England haven where people of mixed descent could be. I wanted to make a new passport for all the mixed race people in the world, whether they knew their mixes or not. I just wanted people to have a place where they feel like they have permission to be themselves, even though the world told them that they weren't good enough or they were in some way a bad mix. Taking old parts of the South Side, relocating those things to Germany to try to make a German defunct house funky again. as the bulldozers were coming for St. Lawrence, I asked the demolition team, could me and my band just go into church one more time? Like, as the bulldozers are going, could we have a final sermon in the space that, even though I don't have the capacity to prevent the building from being torn down, is there still action in its very last breath? Could it do an amazing work? And if you look at the upper arc, you see the Last Supper. And I looked up, and I said to the disciples, look, stop eating that chicken. Peter, come on down, man. Put that wine down. Jesus, you so bad. Why don't you just stop to just kind of take a brick by brick, and restore your sanctuary? Would you please? Mark, Matthew, John, could you come hang out with the brothers? Sing with us. Where the sisters at? If the sisters were here this Last Supper, we would be restored in this building. Come on, where are the policymakers, the sisters that are project managers, the sisters that are legislators? Can we do something different? The bulldozers came. But it was a good practice, a good song, a good effort, a kind of poetry. And maybe the practice is in some ways about reflection, and trying to use reflection as a way of understanding, like, oh, I bet something really beautiful happened there once. That if I reflect long enough, the reflection might lead me to a kind of poetry. That I might want to write about the things that I've been reflecting on. The poetry might lead me toward empathy. Like, man, it must be hard for the archdiocese to think about what to do with all these buildings they've accumulated over the last 150 years in the United States. What do you do when there's no clergy, there's no members, there's no attendees at the parish, there's no parishioners? And so I found myself like really empathic toward the Catholic Church. Like, man, there's a lot of beautiful nunneries and rectories around the hood. There's a lot of beautiful synagogues, big churches in the hood. Like, what do we do with these buildings? And so again, I would just find myself trying to take small extractions from the building to try to demonstrate that there was still life and energy, a practice of reflecting. And sometimes from these things, I would be able to share these things with the world, like this beautiful floor from the gymnasium at the National Gallery of American Art. That sometimes the resources from these objects would allow me to then acquire the buildings and work toward their restoration. And I found myself in a loop practice of reflecting, making poetry, creating objects, selling those objects, and then reinvesting those things in the neighborhood that I lived in. So that the confessional became a DJ booth for Frankie Knuckles, a really important DJ here who spun house music, a kind of liberation act for the queer youth in the middle 80s here in Chicago. That even in the absence of the sacred space, I was trying to build new sacred spaces, sacred in a big S kind of way. Like, can we take the clapboards from an old ship where slaves were and sugar was moved from one part of Europe to another part of the Caribbean? Can we take those boards that were at one point boards of trauma and offer them as a new sacred space inside of a sacred space, inside of a sacred space? I'll be honest, to try to make meaning out of devastation is a heavy lift. To constantly try to make meaning from traumatic events around the world, it's not really fun. But I found that if I can start with that trauma becomes a kind of urgency, an urgency of empowerment, a reaction to my purpose. I found myself kindled by the idea that there's been a wrong and that maybe there's some poetic or pragmatic gesture that I could offer to make things a little bit better. And so I make art. But in addition to making art, you know, I'm thinking about the South Side of Chicago. I'm thinking about Livernois and Detroit. I'm thinking about Sugar Hill, Strawberry Mansion in Philadelphia. I'm thinking about these places where buildings aren't what people need, money isn't what people need. Folk need hope. Folk need opportunity. They need friendship with policymakers. Sometimes they need to share vision, and I think that's part of what Upswell is about, This big project that I've done here in Chicago is it's a building on 67th, 68th and Stony Island called the Stony Island Arts Bank today. It was one of these dilapidated buildings that for 30 years or so, no one knew what to do with. And when I first said that it could be a kind of cultural center, community, pinball, I don't know, shooting range, something, dance hall, the city just found it hard to believe that a person who had no development background could pull it off. And I just found myself realizing that the tools that I needed weren't just the tools of development or entrepreneurship, they were tools of belief, that I really believed that a cultural space should live in my neighborhood and I shouldn't have to go to another neighborhood. I believed that the people who lived around me deserved the right to see all the things that I had seen whenever I go anywhere else in the world. That there should be collisions between people who have a lot and people who don't have a lot, and that collision would happen because the best culture making in the world was happening where it happens. I had a dream. And so, sometimes I feel like the poetry that I'm interested in starts with a kind of blank page. It's like, all right, could this building, this container, if I build it, could I eventually find the things that I hope to benefit from? At the same time that I was restoring the bank, I got a call from Linda Johnson Rice, who's the heiress of Johnson Publishing. And she said, Theaster, I know that you have these books. You really like books. I have some old books. And Linda invited me to come to the Johnson Publishing building. And on the 7th floor was the library, the editorial library of Johnson Publishing, 26,000 books. And I thought I'd kind of focus on this project for a moment. That Linda, who didn't know me very well at all, was reflecting on my reflection. And she wanted a sacred place for her father's things. And so it became a sacred space inside of a sacred space. She trusted me that I would care for these objects, that these objects would be made available to a public. But she also gave my building that was an interesting blank slate, interesting canvas. She gave my building purpose with these books. And I think that this idea that people working together, you have a little bit of this and I have a little bit of that, and you have knowledge of the built environment and I have knowledge of policy, I have access to resources, I know the people who live in the hood, that it's only when all these people come together that really, really great things happen. In order to have fun, sometimes I try to start these PowerPoints without knowing what the next image is. So I don't really know what's next. How am I doing so far? We're looking at the roof of the Tamir Rice gazebo. Tamir Rice, 12-year-old, 2015, was shot by a cop in Cleveland. He had a toy gun. He was playing outside, and people started to come to the site after Tamir's death to mourn and to ask what could be done. The city was concerned that there might become a mob, and as a result, they were ready to destroy the gazebo. I got a call from Samaria Rice, who said, hey, they're trying to tear down this gazebo. Can you come help? Long story short, as I'm practicing my little art thing, I feel like purpose is preparing me for these moments where artists are absolutely the right people to respond to the spatial trauma that happens in the world. And I feel so grateful to be in this moment where more people are invited to more places to talk together to try to do things that will change this world. Thank you guys so much for having me this morning. I hope you have a really fortunate day.